Right. So it's a pleasure for me to represent my ideas on from digital medicine, in fact, of what real-world healthcare data actually is and how we can bring it to research and to care. And when we think about digital medicine, we usually think about applications and smartphones and wearables that all need to undergo a translational research cycle where engineers or data scientists develop something new and then which is tested in a clinical setting, so in doctors and patients' environment. And then we think about how do we bring it actually into the population to give population health back, and of course, how we integrate it into the healthcare process. And I will guide you a little bit through this concept in the next couple of minutes. So we have an idea and we want to bring it to a product. That is actually the idea of translational research in medicine. And while we do so, we need to prove technical readiness, but also functionality, safety, and quality. You know, GDPR and data science is a big issue. But even more so, we need to prove that there is a patient value, so any benefit for patients. And if that is all shown, we want to transfer these technologies into healthcare. And my experience comes basically from sensor-based gait analysis, largely in Parkinson's, but also in other diseases where we have wearable sensors connected to a shoe and they measure how patients walk. And finally, this was a research project and then also a successful startup from the university. And it has become an application, a smartphone application connected to wearable sensors. And we are currently testing that in not only Parkinson's, but also multiple sclerosis and other chronic diseases that affect functional ability. So I give you an example of what these sensors can measure. For example, here, gait speed and stride length in multiple sclerosis. And what you see is a pretty typical technical validation study showing that in a group of patients here, about 240 patients with multiple sclerosis, with an increase of clinical scores. Here you see the clinical evaluation by the EDSS, which is the established clinical score done by a physician, how that correlates to gait speed and stride length, two exemplary parameters for gait. And that is quite interesting because here, by definition, the first four levels of the EDSS do not have gait impairment. However, the sensor sees more sensitive that patients actually have a reduction in these parameters. But that is a nice research tool and we have a good scientific outcome here. But even more so, it's important to understand how we could help patients on an individual level. And that is even more advanced in the translation of technology into healthcare. And you see here exemplary three patients where the gait sensor, the black line, is measured, and at the same time the clinical evaluation of a doctor after a dopamine shot, so a treatment. And usually you expect within the next 15 to 45 minutes a response in a patient, and you see the first patient responds very nicely. So the score goes down from the doctor's point of view and the sensor's point of view, whereas in the other two patients that is not as ideal. And this is actually the typical healthcare scenario because not every patient reacts as the other. So if you want to talk about real world data and real world application, you have to accept that there's patients that respond very differently from each other. So this was just the example of going through the whole world, starting at bench to bedside and then really going into community with a sensor that is attached to a shoe. But then we realized, okay, it's not enough. As I said, we need we need an application that measures the patient-reported information or outcomes, the PROMs or PREMs, as we say, and connect them also with the healthcare system because the sensor needs to report this information to people, to healthcare providers, to hospitals, but maybe even to home nurses and new concepts. So if this is done, we need to do another type of research, which basically can be called as an implementation research, showing the medical benefit or the economic effect of such an application, because a sensor is not an application. But as again, we wanted to test if we can bring this sensor technology into the real world environment and into home care. And here it is an example of what happens if we give the sensor to a patient and let him record at home. And you see a couple of weeks in the beginning and then a couple of days recorded, and the stride length as an exemplary parameter here is all over the place. You have high numbers, low numbers, and if you just look at the spread between 85 centimeters to 115 centimeters, this difference from day to day varies substantially within one single patient, and that difference is in fact stronger than the difference between patient and controls from the group knowledge which we gathered before. So the question is, how can we make use of such a data if we think about real-world monitoring and not a standardized test in a laboratory environment? And to go to that data, we need to go back one step to understand what actually happened to the patient while we did this recording. And I have to tell you that the patient is, in different situations. And let's think about these situations which we have to address when we think about translation of real-world data into research and care. So we have a lot of medical data that comes from clinical annotated data, doctors' data, etc., hospital or outpatient unit. We have new sensors or apps which give us another data. And we, of course, have here, for example, in Luxembourg, ParkinsonNet, additional information which comes from the integrated care model. And we have a patient, and you see the patient journey here, starting with a low symptom level, but over disease progression, the symptom changes. And you see ups and downs. And when we look at these data points, and we don't know what data there is, but just the concept, in the beginning, we want to predict that the disease starts. So a symptom starts to be present and the symptom level aggravates. Sometimes we have quite strong levels of symptoms and then we need to treat them. So we call it therapy response. And of course, if we have a patient in a good situation, then we need to predict again when it's getting worse. And this happens again and again and again throughout the course of the disease. The big problem is, if we talk about real-world data, nobody annotates these situations. We only can do this if we have a clinical trial where we know in the beginning the patient is in a bad situation and later he should be better, so we can compare treatment or any other aspects. Or we look at data, maybe driven from pharmaceutical studies or from hospitals or from healthcare insurance, where we actually don't know, was a patient actually in a good or in a bad situation. So nobody knows if the patient is in therapy response or prediction, etc. And all of a sudden, we need to annotate this from the real world data. And you see here something which we called patient journey or patient management pathway, where the clinical decision requires a continuous monitoring, connected care information, and reporting back to continuously adapt the clinical decision in the treatment paradigm, in the end, to reach the best progression line over time. So coming back with this idea and going back to the patient-doctor's communication in real world on an individual level, we see that the doctor and the patient, they communicate with each other, and usually we call this treatment. And when we think about this process, again, either the patient is in a best treatment mode, so it's fine in chronic diseases, or we have to say, no, it's really bad. We need to change the therapy, meaning increasing the therapy, adapting, or see how we can adjust it. Or we are not sure, deterioration, so is it really true or not? So in this situation of this communication or treatment paradigm, a sensor enters. And the sensor that measures exactly the same thing from real-world data has different aspects. Either can monitor or measure how the best treatment actually works. It can support the therapy change, clinical decision support, or it can confirm the deterioration. And this is very important if we apply a sensor in a real-world setting, because from that data we need feedback both for the management of these three paradigms, but also for the visualization and the reporting into this communication strategy. And all that has to be put into a smartphone application to make the patient's life better. And we did this and we realized we have to really adjust the measurement paradigm in real-world data to these three treatment paradigms. If we were in a best treatment, we ask the patient to record every day patient-reported outcome measures, but only once a week sensor data, because we do not need this every day because the patient is in a good mood. And in the end of the week, we ask the patient, how do you like it? And then if the patient says, well, I was not so happy this week, we say, okay, then next week we measure every day to confirm that it's either really bad or actually wasn't that good. So then again, the patient is referred to a doctor saying, please change the therapy. And if the therapy changes, we again have to measure every day to confirm that the therapy works. So it's a really communication concept and not only a sensor assessment if we want to get real world data into any kind of clinical decision support or research context. And we did this in this same pattern that I've shown you before. So we labeled every data point with a patient evaluation to see how he feels himself. So was it a good day or a bad day? And to cut a long story short, this is what happens if we look at it. So you see a green area, which is defined by the patient's rating, I'm in a good situation, and the red area, which defines I'm not in a good situation. And we realized that this patient turned from a well-treated patient to a progression patient that was not so well treated. And you see the end of the gray area, this was a treatment change. The medication was increased again, and all of a sudden the data came back. So all of a sudden, if we take into account the real-world annotation coming from this treatment paradigm, we can make sense of all this data. And this is really the idea of getting sensors into healthcare support systems, into digital therapeutics or digital monitoring systems. And this is really the valorization and the translation of research of data into healthcare processes. But it's also important to annotate this real-world data in such a way. So in a way to summarize this translation from bench to bedside and then into population health and community really reveals that in the end we end up with patient-centered service. And I have to tell you that in Germany there's a new law that allows these kind of apps to be reimbursed by the healthcare insurance if they show a patient value and then they get access to the digital health market. This is called the German DiGA process or the digital health application. And all you have to show is that the application, which could combine PROM and PREM and objective outcomes by sensors, has actually a positive healthcare effect. This is a patient-centered effect showing that he benefits from this application and not that the data is correct or important for the disease. So the patient-centered benefit is here really the certification reason why an app gets evidence-based certified and then enters the German healthcare market. And the research in digital medicine, what we do, is actually addressing all these aspects. Of course, the health problem aspects and characteristics and clinical effectiveness, but also the economic aspects. The patient perspective, as I said, is very important. The communication of patient to include them into this healthcare process, but also the organizational and safety aspects, and of course the question of social, ethical, and legal impact. And I have to tell you that this is not just a story that happened in Germany, but last week or early in the beginning of November, Macron announced 650 million euros for the same process in France. So we see now that these new type of digital therapeutics as a valorization of our research become something very relevant in healthcare, and they reach the market. So therefore, we know what needs to be done. But let me finish by asking you, what does it mean to us? The doctor gets an objective feedback on his treatment effect. The payer knows where he invests the money for. The provider all of a sudden is facing a new benchmarking system because the patient knows which hospital or which healthcare provider treats this patient best. And what happens to the patient? Well, we participate in healthcare much better as patients, as people, as society. And in the end, these new real-world evidence could even generate a pay-per-performance concept where not the service is paid for, but the success on a patient-per-patient level. And if we reach that, I think we are also done with this digital transformation in medicine. And I'm done with my presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I'm very open to answer this question. Thank you very much.